Story time. When I started coding, I had no specific intention in mind besides maybe money and easing my boredom. Naive to the world I was stepping into, I started with Python like many do, did my first Hello World application, and was off to the races. My roommate at the time overheard I was learning to code and he wanted to join me. Without talking about it at all, he started with Python as well. How dare that little shit step on my toes like that, I joked. I've been learning Python. How dare he pick a different language, I exasperated. I was about 3 weeks into learning Python at this point, and I hadn't escaped the console yet. Where's the graphics, I thought while watching another dry YouTube tutorial. I wanted to build applications I could use in my day-to-day life, with some user interface, so with that and my roommate totally stepping on my mojo, I decided to switch languages. I wanted a bona fide Windows application, so I took the natural course of action, JavaScript. After about a month of tinkering, making some graphical things that I honestly had a blast making, I made a really simple video game in JavaScript using some nondescript characters that just set everything in motion. Let's make a game, I said to myself like a crazy person. Hours later, I was downloading an application called Unity because I googled JavaScript game development and read that Unity had JavaScript support. After download and first boot, I discovered a channel called Brackeys, may it rest in peace. His tutorials and most tutorials I found use a language called C#. They all seemed very beginner-friendly, so instead of looking for JavaScript tutorials, I decided to follow along. One tutorial after another, and weeks later, I eventually had something going in Unity that I was happy with. And instead of releasing what I had made on Steam as an early access release, I did something crazy. I completely scrapped the project, chalked it up to a learning experience, and bought all of Mosh Hamadani's tutorials on Udemy about C#, which I only watched about a quarter of. The rest is boring history. So why the story? Well, since I started coding, there has always been one project that has eluded me. The Snake game. The first time I attempted was when I was learning Python. I attempted to follow along with a tutorial that was way too advanced for me at the time and gave up. The second time was when I was learning JavaScript and again, gave up. The third was while I was learning C# and you guessed it, I totally made it. Just kidding, I gave up. Here I am years later and I still have never made a snake game. And recently I rewatched Code Bullet's video about making the perfect snake AI. I figured maybe now I could give it a shot. Originally this was going to be a video about the A* algorithm, but I had a fun challenge in mind. That's right, from one extreme to the next, from not being able to follow a tutorial to doing it without even a Google search. It has been years since I last tried, and I wouldn't exactly call myself a beginner anymore, so I figured I could spice it up. So let me say a few things first. 1, this was a completely random idea that spawned strictly from my intense desire to just go absolutely ape coding something. 2, no internet. Meaning no Google, YouTube, C# documentation, Unity documentation, nor Stack Overflow was used. I even went as far as avoiding my own code as well. I didn't exactly turn off the internet for this, nor can I prove that I adhered to this rule, but this challenge was personal for me, so you'll just have to trust me. And 3, the challenge stopped as soon as I had something that I can call a game of Snake. And that's it. All that's left to do is to boot Unity. While I was loading, I started thinking about what I knew I would have to achieve with the game. 1, I knew the movement of the snake would have to follow some sort of grid pattern. 2, the apple the snake eats would have to spawn and live on this grid as well. And 3, if the snake touched a defined border or itself, then the snake dies and it is game over. Loading finished and the problems started immediately. Firstly, I love Unity, and I've done my fair share of tinkering, but I'm in no way an expert. This was apparent right away because the first thing I chose to do was just spawn an apple. But I had no clue how the camera works, so how was I supposed to be able to detect and keep the apple spawning within the camera's view? This led me to the code and discovering that the camera class had class members that would tell you the resolution of the camera in pixels, meaning I could now pull the width and height from the camera, albeit in pixels, but it was progress. Visually, I could tell the camera was about 10 meters in height and about 18 meters in width, considering Unity uses meters for its scene view grid, but what were the actual numbers, I thought? This is typically a question I would Google, but instead I took a look at the camera settings in the inspector and discovered that the orthographic size is 5. I tinkered around with the perspective in the game view and noticed that no matter the perspective you chose, the orthographic size didn't change. For example, in free aspect, if you widen the view, the field of view gets wider, but if you heighten the view, the field of view doesn't change, instead, the view zooms. This meant that the orthographic size is the radius of the camera height in meters. This means that if you're using full HD, you can translate these numbers with some simple math. If you multiply 1920 by 5 and divide by 1080, you get the radius of the width in meters, which ended up being 8.8 repeating or something like that. And in retrospect, this was just a big waste of time because not only did I have to use math in a project I didn't think I'd have to use math in, but also I could have just defined the bounds in code, but doing it this way meant that I had the added benefit of it working no matter the shape nor size of the window. Which sounds cool, but by the end I can find the resolution and window size, so now that I have the camera bounds, I can work on spawning an apple inside of it. I had to determine the size of each grid cell before continuing. For now, I settled on 1/5 of a meter. With the numbers in mind, I can generate a random location by dividing the width and the height of the camera bounds by the grid cell size, and then calling the random class and picking a random number between the output number and its opposite on the negative side. I could then multiply the output of each by the grid cell size and then use these numbers as a vector 3 to instantiate apples on the grid. Though I knew the camera width of 8.8 repeating would be a problem, so I used mathf.floor to round down to 8 because it was much easier to work with whole numbers mathematically. Next was the snakehead, which was aptly going to be a white square, and moving things I knew how to do using the transform component. I created some simple code to determine the direction the snake would move and then worked on actually moving the snake. I chose to avoid using time.deltaTime and a speed variable for controlling the snake's movement because I knew I needed to jump ahead by 1/5 of a meter with every move or it wouldn't look as though the snake is on a grid. But also, I couldn't just add 1/5 of a meter to the snake at every frame or else the snake would turn into Sonic the Hedgehog. Instead, I decided I would control the speed by means of an integer variable and an if statement. I can nest the movement code inside this if statement, increment the integer variable with every frame, and when the variable reaches a set amount, the movement code can fire and then the variable is reset. I thought about using a coroutine and using the waitForFrames class, but I don't use it often and couldn't remember how to write it properly. Also, I'm pretty sure that works async, I think. There's probably a better way to do it. Let me know in the comments below. Either way, ta-da! The snake now moved in a way you would expect, and this in no way bit me in the ass later. I then did a bit of code cleaning because I am a disgrace of a programmer, then decided to get the collision working with the apple. I chose not to use colliders for whatever reason, and instead decided to check if the snake and the apple shared the same location. Since everything was on 1/5 of a meter grid, it worked, and I didn't really question it. Now I had to get the body growing and following, which I knew was going to give me the most trouble. Moving and spawning are basics, and I figured it wouldn't give me much trouble, but I had never made any type of code that not only had a growing body but also followed your moves based on a grid. Getting the body parts to spawn, baby garbage, easy, done it a million times, but how do I make it follow? The first idea was to use a multi-dimensional array and just iterate over all the grid points and move things accordingly. As you could tell, I didn't do this because it didn't make much sense. Instead, I relied on good old lists. 2 lists to be exact. In the first list, every time the snake moved, I would prepend the transformed opposition to the list, making the index of 0 the snakehead's most recent move. The second list was a list of all body parts. Every time an apple was eaten, a body part was instantiated, and that game object was appended to a list. This meant that the list position of the body part corresponded directly with the most recent transformed opposition. This may sound simple, but the timing took a while to figure out. For example, index 0 of the body parts list is the first body part spawned, but this also means that index 0 of the transformed opposition list needs to be the snakehead's prior position, meaning the sequence of events needs to be this. 1. The snakehead's position is added to the list. 2. The snakehead moves to a new position. Then 3. The body parts are then spawned in. Lastly, I had to figure out how the body moves and follows the snakehead, which should have been extremely simple because I have a list of all the moves it makes, but I somehow made it extremely headache-inducing. The solution was simple. If we focus on the game object at index 0 of the body parts list, when it is spawned, it is put at index 0 of the moves list. When the snakehead moves, the list is appended with the new move, meaning index 0 of the body parts list is no longer at index 0 of the moves list. Instead, it is at position stored at index 1. So all we have to do is iterate over all the body parts every time the snakehead moves. Then we reset the body parts transform to the corresponding index of the moves list. That took a good hour to figure out. The next hour was spent trying to figure out why the f*** was I getting the lowercase I looking head-ass snake. I figured it was because I was using two different scripts, one to move the snakehead and one for everything else. The integer variables and the if statement method I was using to control the speed of things on both scripts were out of sync with each other. So I moved the if statement on the main script to late update and it seemed to fix itself. This was in no way the problem I discovered many hours after the challenge ended, but it worked for my purposes. The snake now worked and the rest was easy. Spawn a border that the snake can't touch, make it to where the snake can't turn back on itself with some simple movement script stuff, cause a game over if the snake touches its body, which was just simply restarting the game, test, debug, repeat, and challenge finished. 3.5 hours later, I have made my first snake game without any help. I had so much fun I spent another 22 hours building UI, debugging, doing sound design, making leaderboards, and thinking about how I'd like to try this with more games in the future. And here's what the final game looked like. I plan on doing more in the future, but for now, I hope you enjoyed. I uploaded this version onto my itch.io page, which is down in the description. I don't know when I'll add more games to it, but you can play this version for now if you want. There was only one thing I couldn't fix, and that was that sometimes the apple spawns on top of or underneath the snake, even though I wrote functioning code to prevent this, and I definitely just did functioning with finger quotations. Oh well, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Thanks for watching. I promised user, definitely going to butcher this name, Ios. Either way, I promised him that I would say penultimate in my next video, but I didn't really have the chance, so penultimate. Like, comment, and subscribe, maybe. I'm not forcing you or anything. This gun is just for show. Okay, bye.